Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 25 of the Fair Housing Insiders. We welcome you back. We're so grateful to have you here as we get into another super important topic along the lines of senior housing and senior living in dealing with mental health challenges, mental health conditions. So we have special guests with us here today. We're going to introduce them in just a moment, but let's get to our other host, our co-host, Kathy Williams. Nice to have you with us. How are you doing today?
I'm good, and I'm looking forward to talking about a topic that is perhaps the most difficult fair housing topic there is. So it's great that we've invited these guys to come share their experiences struggling with this topic, and I'll let you introduce it, Jonathan.
Yeah. Grateful to have you both back. You were on episode 24 with us, so here we are. You were so good on episode 24. We just have to do an episode 25 on this topic. So welcome to the show. So we have with us Brandon Ball from Wesley Senior Living and George Tucker from Campbell-Stone. Welcome, gentlemen. Give us a little insight on where you are, your job positions, and the properties you're on.
Kathy, Jonathan, thanks for having us. As Jonathan mentioned, my name is Brandon Ball. I'm an administrator at Wesley Senior Living. I manage a community that we have in East Atlanta, Georgia, and we're a senior building that is completely subsidized, that is. So as I stated before, it's a pleasure working with seniors every day. It provides a really good challenge, and it's really rewarding work.
Yes, nice to have you on the show. George?
Yes, sir. So my name is George Tucker. I am an administrator with Campbell-Stone Senior Living. I'm the administrator at Campbell-Stone Sandy Springs. Our other location is in Buckhead. So that's the two of them. My community is an affordable senior housing community, completely HUD subsidized. We have a couple of wrinkles. We have our 9th floor, which is a personal care floor, which is kind of like assisted living light. And then we also have a mandatory meal program, which is something that you don't see in a lot of the subsidized communities anymore. And that's pretty much us.
Yeah. Well, we're so grateful to have you both here. Very important topic. When you think of just the expression mental health challenges or mental health disabilities, in most circles, it's still such a taboo topic even to discuss, but a super important one, as Kathy highlighted, in relation to senior housing. So let's just get right into our subject today. When it comes to mental health behaviors, what are your insights? How do we accommodate them, and to what extent?
Well, obviously, you're still bound by your lease and your house rules. A person who's dealing with the difficulty of a mental health condition that may impair their judgment or ability to be able to interact with staff or fellow residents, vendors coming through the building can actually pose a pretty considerable challenge. I found that using my service coordinator has been very helpful with this, along with us piloting a behavioral health program to help identify and get people who maybe are not being adequately treated, the treatment they need within the community. But obviously from the fair housing perspective, basically accommodating a reasonable a condition that may provide some challenges to the rest of the residents, but also still being able to enforce the letter of our lease and our house rules.
Brandon, so like my first thought was like, how do we accommodate this person? And that's oftentimes the question. If somebody is fighting somebody in the hallway, I don't know what the accommodation for that is. But to say that behaviors that are egregious in nature can't be fixed or changed is also a little bit short-sighted. Brandon, do you remember the gentleman that we had, the resident who lived in the community, that he had a medication change? This gentleman was on a strict regimen for a mental issue for 20 years. Medication changed by some new doctor, and his behaviors were completely outside of the man that I had known for 4 years. It got it got pretty, it was a lot. And there were a lot of feathers ruffled. But like he came, so we addressed it. We did lease violations. We talked about 30-day notices to vacate, all of those things. And then but we also looked at it as a reasonable accommodation. He had a strong support group. He had his physicians that stated that X, Y, and Z were going to be being done. We had conversations with the one of the people who he offended the most, just making sure that they felt safe as we worked through this, us trying to reasonably accommodate him. And to my knowledge, he's still a resident at the community now,
yes.
right, Brandon? Yeah, and a like your textbook good resident, guy who's kind and nice. So had we have just been like, wow, this behavior is egregious, you've got to go. That would have this man is proof that sometimes there are reasonable accommodations that can be made, that can help them get back into living by the letter of our lease and living under those rules.
Great experience. Thank you so much for sharing with that. That's a practical example of seeing that in action. Kathy, you have any comments on that?
That is a great example. And I would just say that one of the unique things with mental health disabilities is, for instance, in George's example, I doubt that resident asked for a reasonable accommodation. Instead, you were sensitive enough to realize something was out of whack here and to talk to him about it, figure out that this was going to take some time and effort and some involvement with his doctor and medication or whatever. So sometimes it is necessary to, if you think it might be a mental health disability, to not wait for the resident to ask. Instead, the management motivates the discussion that brings these topics up. And that's different than our usual rule, which is we wait for the resident to ask.
Very good. Yes. Thank you for bringing that all together for us, Kathy. So I love it. Thanks for getting this conversation started. So that leads into another scenario. Love your insights, George and Brandon, on what happens if you're just dealing with maybe a mean person. How do you deal with that situation? Is that just their nature, or do they have a disability? So you kind of had an example where you knew the individual, and so that was like a trigger, something's off. But what if you don't have that background? And how do you, any experience or comments on dealing with those scenarios?
I think that, like you mentioned, that I knew that gentleman from the previous scenario. I think the same thing holds true. Like, it's the pattern. There's a pattern of behavior. More often than not, if you go through an eviction through the courts, you have to present that there's this pattern of behavior for material noncompliance. So if we have a mean person, or if we have a person whose behaviors, whether they're related to a mental health issue or not, are that's just what they're always doing. You have occurrence report after occurrence report after occurrence report about them saying saying things to people that are inappropriate. Then I think that you have your pattern there. Now, as to whether or not it's something that can be reasonably accommodated, that's another discussion that you have to take with each situation. But like this is a question that we've been having recently. I have a situation going on right now, but like a person's, even their disability can't spill over onto other folks in a negative, and negatively impact them. It's the gift and the curse of multifamily communities. We got thinner walls than we care for. We got, we share hallways and space and smells and air and all of that. Kind of our backstop, our kind of line of the sand is like, we can't let these things continually spill over onto other folks. And what's the disrupt the peaceful enjoyment of the community, which is a part in most of our leases. There's some wording like that. You're disrupting someone else's peaceful enjoyment of the community.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for that. Brandon or Kathy, any follow-up thoughts or comments?
I think George pretty adequately covered that topic from the perspective that I would.
You know, sometimes in our first example that George gave, because the behavior was different, they knew to be concerned and to ask and to look deeper into it. If the behavior of interfering with other residents and being nasty and abusive to staff, cursing at them, if that's a long-term behavior, one thing I usually recommend as a reasonable accommodation when you think it might be a mental health behavior problem is patience and giving the person another chance. If that's the way they've always been, and it is disruptive and a violation of their lease, giving them another chance is probably not going to work. Because they've always been like this. So I think that's a good point and a good difference to make, whether this is just a personality of this person or if it possibly is, for instance, the onset of Alzheimer's or some kind of memory impairment that sometimes can bring with it inappropriate behavior. So I think it's up to the administrator to know their residents so that they can be sensitive to those things.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, use the word patience. I can only imagine trying to put myself in your shoes, Brandon and George, like what that must be like to balance out residents who are having those challenges and those who aren't, and being that mediator, that go-between, and showing patience and doing the right thing, and fair housing, of course, on top of all of that. So, appreciate your...
The harder part is asking the persons affected for patience. Mm-hmm. And having to ask that, or say, we're working through our process. You can't give them any details, but we're working through our process. Please be patient. And that's the hardest ask.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a really good point, because you can't tell them what you're doing with this other resident. That's confidential. And yet you need to let them know you're hearing their concerns and you are taking action. You're not just ignoring it. And that's a major challenge.
Right. Right. Very good. So hat tip to both of you. It sounds like some tricky situations, but you're managing it, and you've got a clear outline, policy as a company on how to handle those different scenarios. So that leads us to our third scenario. So how do you deal with residents who use mental health to their own advantage, to their personal advantage? Have you come across that? Any comments or thoughts on that topic?
I've definitely had residents who I've known, and it's been known by certain members of the staff, to deal with mental health conditions, to use it to excuse poor behavior, usually interpersonal behavior between either they and staff or they and their neighbors. In each one of those situations, I usually spoke directly with them regarding the incident at hand, and the person would say, well, my nerves, I was having a bad day, I have my nervous condition. It actually makes me think to an incident last week with a resident who was using some fairly abusive language with staff. And, I called her into my office, and funny enough, we were dealing with a reasonable accommodation for a physical disability that she has. But, she explained, I have, a nervous condition. And I was like, well, I understand that, but you have to understand that we still can't allow this type of behavior. And, I understand that you may have, good and bad days, but we need to do what we can from your end to mitigate that, whether it be, speaking with your doctor and adjusting your treatment and things like that. But also letting her know and being direct that the behavior wouldn't be accepted, if necessary, fill out a lease violation for the particular incident if it rose to that. And then also, to speak to what George was saying in the previous scenario, running back, in this case, back to my staff, let them know what I was doing. It's like, hey, I've spoken to this person. I've let them know that it's not acceptable. So they know that, it's being addressed, and also, setting the example for other residents who may or may not have conditions to understand that there's going to be, certain type of decorum within our community.
Excellent.
I think that's a good point that Brandon brings up about the other staff people.
Mm-hmm.
As I'm out doing training, I get a lot of responses from the staff people I'm training that their administration of their property ignores bad behavior by residents, either because they're not sure whether it's about a disability or they don't know what to do, or their company believes that, if old people act up, you just put up with it, kind of thing. And it really is hard on the morale of the staff if they feel there are no controls in place. So it's not only for the other residents that there needs to be controls, it is for the staff to feel like they are being protected from abuse by residents.
Right. Very good. Yeah. It appears that communication has to be taken to another level in those kinds of situations. Very good. Any other thoughts on this topic overall? So here we've covered some main key elements and come up with mental health and dealing in senior living. Any closing thoughts, closing situations, or anything along that line you'd like to share with us?
I'd add, if possible, either through local professional organizations or just seeking it out in your local community, if you could find someone who teaches a mental health first aid class. I found that to be beneficial training for our staff, so that not only are they being more educated around what the expressions of certain conditions may be, they're better and more equipped to kind of, understand that this person is dealing with something, and, to some degree, they can't help that, what's happening in their mind is happening at the time, but that, certain conditions, are triggered by certain things, and the ways to avoid it. So I think that it's been useful for our community to be able to go to trainings like that to become, better trained around mental health in general.
Nice tip.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Brandon. Appreciate it.
The kind of final thought that I had was Brandon was saying they have a mental health counselor that assists with these types of behavioral issues. My sister community has one that's through a grant, I think, with the county, and we're looking into how do we do that? How do we replicate that in our community? Because it's the administrator at Campbell-Stone Buckhead has just spoken so highly of the helpfulness of it. And when you get to it, we're talking about somebody's home, somebody's ability to have housing. If you have an eviction through the courts, you are not eligible for affordable housing anymore. And that's not what any of us in this industry are really trying to do. But we still have this community to keep going.
Yeah.
So we're just trying to find any type of help that we can, and keep it, help just keep everything between the rails,
Nice. Yeah, very good. Yeah, thank you for adding that in. Nice tips. Nice way to wrap this up and kind of round out the whole discussion. So thank you, guys. Big round of applause for being on the show again today. Kathy and I, and the audience, more importantly, really appreciate your insights and bringing this topic to the open and what can be done. So a lot of key takeaways that I'm sure everybody took notes on. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll get you in on another show, I'm sure, in the future when we get back on this topic. So, but until then, this has been episode 25 of the Fair Housing Insiders. Thank you again for being here on this show. We do have a course that's available on senior living and fair housing. So be sure to check that out on our website. And thank you for giving us that thumbs up and sharing this with your community. This is our way of giving back to our industry, providing this complimentary fair housing education. We appreciate your support. Thank you for being here. We'll see you on our next show. Take care, everyone.